The Bicycle Frame Builder's Apprentice, Chapter 17. Tuesday evening, and a meeting was to be held in the upper room of the George in Hayfield Village. Jed Gartside had promised Malc some rare entertainment, and insisted he be present. He'd also persuaded Benny Rothman and Jack O'Donnell to attend as well. He deemed that 3 representatives of Manchester's working-class riffraff would be sufficient to witness the proceedings, not least because all 3 were notorious Reds. The meeting had been called for 8 o'clock prompt to mobilise opposition to the celebrations of the mass trespass due to commence a week the following Friday. The main speaker was to have been a Mr. Palfrey, but, unfortunately, unexpected business had detained him elsewhere. As Jed had been one of the first people to be made aware of this unexpected development, he, being a public-spirited individual, had contacted the clerk to the parish council, who happened to be billed to chair the meeting in his personal capacity, and offered to stand in as speaker at short notice. The clerk to the PC naturally accepted this offer with alacrity. Jed Gartside was a well-known and well-respected member of the local community. His family had farmed in the area for untold generations. His offer appeared to be a godsend. If anybody could rally the villagers and rout the despicable Manchester workers and communist insurgents, he was the man. The clerk was known to be a thoroughly nice fellow and a gentleman. He was also, like all too many of his breed, extremely naive. At 6:30 that evening, Jed Gartside, Elsie, Ralph and Connie began their walk from the farm, accompanied by Malc and Tom and Benny Rothman. They would pick Pearl and Mikey up on the way. Jack O'Donnell and young Rosie were already ensconced in the side parlour in the George Hotel, which was already buzzing with life. Jack had suffered from bronchitis the previous winter. He was still having trouble with his chest, and his ability to walk had deteriorated. Consequently, Benny had dropped him off in the village earlier, having picked him up in Edgeley, and Rosie had decided to keep her beloved grandad company. "So, what's going on?" Benny asked. "You know very well what's going on," Jed responded. "We're going to a public meeting to sort out once and for all whether you and your allies should continue to celebrate the mass trespass and, according to some, continue to disturb the peace of our village." Benny shook his head. Malc smiled. "But how come you were the main speaker?" "Because I'm a very respectable man with a great deal of influence and insider knowledge." Elsie gave her husband a look, her eyebrows raised a good half-inch. Malc smiled again, and so did Connie. Benny didn't notice their reactions, or else he might have addressed his next question elsewhere. "Insider knowledge? Knowledge of what?" "Ah, Benny, my friend, that's the key question, and all will be revealed, but not till we are sat in the George with my old mate Jack O'Donnell." The diminutive white-haired rambler looked up at him, but before he had chance to frame another question, Malc was knocking on Pearl's door. "How's Mum, Grandad?" The old man put his pint pot onto the round table top and licked the froth from the bottom of his top lip. "Working too hard as usual. She sends her love, Rosie." "Is she still coming up for Easter?" He nodded. "You can meet her off the bus Thursday night." "I've missed her, Grandad." She looked up at him, her bright blue eyes shining beneath her mop of long dark hair. "And I've missed you." He chuckled before saying, "And I've missed thee as well. But I'm here now and I'm staying. What mischief have yous been up to?" "We went on a brilliant bike ride and—" She got no further. Jed and the rest crowded into the room. Greetings were exchanged. Enquiries as to who wanted what to drink made, and Jed and Malc dispatched to the bar, whilst the rest found seats and made themselves comfortable. Ralph moved next to Rosie, whilst Connie pulled out a seat for Mikey. Elsie made way for Malc, thus ensuring the frame builder sat between herself and Pearl. Tom moved to find a place by Grandad. Eventually all was sat and sorted. Benny decided it was time to renew the inquiries he'd commenced earlier. Jed beamed a smile, as if relishing being the centre of attention for once in a while. "I had a phone call from police earlier this morning," he informed them. He looked directly at Benny. "As you know, we've been plagued with sheep thieves of late. It's been going on for well over 2 years, and every sheep farmer with flocks on Bleaklow and Kinder, and most moors round about, have been affected. They've taken a few here and a few there, and they usually start about October, November when the ewes are pregnant. This year they've got greedy and taken ewes in lamb and with lamb." He paused for a moment to take breath and a swallow from his beer. Benny found this very interesting, but what it had to do with the mass trespass and the meeting soon to start, he hadn't a clue. Nonetheless, he curbed his tongue, sure he was about to find out. Jed put down his pint and resumed his narrative. "To cut a long story short, late Sunday afternoon, we made a breakthrough, or at least our Connie did." "And Malc and Tom," Connie intervened, "they were the ones who got the Land Rover's number." "Aye, they are right, lass." He smiled and then said, "Anyhow, Connie phoned the police Sunday, and they phoned me this morning. They've tracked the thieves down to a farm near a place called Prestbury in Cheshire, a farm that's listed as a dairy farm with a prize Frisian herd, but in latter years has also specialised in fattening up sheep for slaughter on the side." Tom looked at his dad. They'd cycled through Prestbury more than once, and they'd taken shelter in one of its pubs, the Admiral Rodney, when caught in a sudden thunderstorm. It was part of the area known as the Golden Triangle, reputed to have more millionaires per acre than any other area of Britain. Benny could contain himself no longer. "This is all very interesting, and I'm pleased they've caught the thieves, but what has it got to do with our celebrations? We've a public meeting in 10 minutes. Jed laughed and took another sip, a very long drawn-out sip, from his pint of Robinson's best bitter. At last he carefully put his pot back on the table. "Everything," he announced. "It's a cast-iron guarantee the celebrations will go ahead. I'm about to make an important public announcement on the very subject. You see, Benny, the Cheshire farm is jointly owned by one of Manchester's biggest meat wholesalers and his sons. You've already met the elder of the family. Their name happens to be Palfrey." The result of the public meeting turned out to be very much as Jed expected it to be, having taken the trouble to ensure local business people attended, including the proprietors of the Three Trees Cafe, the Kinder campsite, various pubs and guest houses, food and souvenir shops, and similar establishments with a vested interest. The result was a decision to send a message of greeting and welcome to the ramblers attending the celebrations, coupled with an instruction to the clerk of the parish council to deliver the message personally and in his official capacity. They then all retreated back to the front parlour of the George, to be treated to a remarkable rendition by Jed himself of an old Lancashire dialect poem by Samuel Laycock, which, despite being written over a century before, seemed to contain a message for those seeking to circumvent the people's freedom to roam. Appropriately enough, it was entitled "The Peers and the People," and went like this: "Clear as a ring, lads, and let's have a feat, and we'll soon have it settled who's wrong and who's right. The people are peers, which is it to be? Let's have a round or two, then we shall see. Must these proud peers take possession at Thelm, and quietly say who's to govern this realm? Are the bees to eat lean and the drones to eat fat, for ever and ever? We'll see about that. Widen that ring, lads, now up with your sleeves, and we'll soon make short work of these lordlings and thieves. Lancashire lads can march up to their graves, but can never be cowards or traitors or slaves. Comrades and friends, shall we give up for now that freedom for which our brave forefathers fought? Nay, never, so long as these feet are well shod, will either win battle or die upon clod. But why talk of dying or have any fears? Well, there's nought in our way but a humful of peers. Let 'em all feel the tips o' our famed wooden shoon, and they'll look for a road out the field, and soon. Clear as a ring then, and let's have a feat, and we'll jolly soon settle it, who's wrong and who's right. The people up peers, which is it to be? Let's have a tussle, and the world shall soon see. Benny Rothman, Malc and Jack congratulated the Derbyshire farmer on his grasp of the Lancashire dialect. Elsie pointed out that her mother had been a spinner at a mill in Little Hayfield, and that it was she who had taught Jed the poem, when he was now but a lad. Furthermore, she added, Mam was originally from Ancoats. Well, dear listener, that was the end of our story, except that it isn't quite the end, because there is a postscript. Benny Rothman continued to trespass. He died in January 2002, 3 months before the 70th anniversary of the 1932 mass trespass. As I shared his politics, being like him a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain up to its termination, I will leave it to what was once the nearest thing to an official Tory press mouthpiece, the Daily Telegraph, to make the final comments on the man who gave me welcome advice and encouragement at a certain stage of my life. Benny Rothman, who has died aged 90, led the Kinder Scout mass trespass of 1932, the first significant event in the movement demanding public access to the countryside. Within 3 years, it had inspired the formation of the Ramblers Association. Then as now, the countryside represented an escape from urban drudgery for many city dwellers, but others saw it as land to be defended from intrusion. At Easter 1932, Rothman and half a dozen members of the British Workers' Sports Federation, a subsidiary of the Young Communist League, were chased off Bleaklow in Derbyshire by gamekeepers. They determined that they would return to try to get up Kinder Scout, the highest hill in the Peak District, and a privately owned sporting estate known to be heavily patrolled by keepers. Several weeks later, Rothman and his colleagues called a rally at a quarry in Hayfield, Derbyshire, expecting around 200 people. In the event, nearly 500 turned up, as well as a large contingent of policemen. When the intended speaker dropped out under pressure from the police, Rothman took his place. Tiny in stature, well under 5 feet tall, but with passionate moral conviction, he harangued the crowd with a stirring attack on the laws of trespass. Then, having warned his audience against using violence towards the keepers, he led the 500-strong crowd up Kinder Scout. Kinder was thick with keepers, Rothman recalled. The professional ones just shouted and waved their sticks. It was the silly buggers that waded in. In the inevitable melee that followed, one keeper sprained his ankle, and a trespasser was arrested. A riotous assembly was then deemed to be taking place. More arrests were made, and 6 participants, including Rothman, were sent for trial. At Derby Assizes, the jury, composed largely of military men and landowners, had no hesitation in finding all 6 defendants guilty. They were sentenced to various terms of imprisonment for riotous behaviour. Rothman's term was 4 months in Leicester jail. The Rambler movement had its first martyrs. In immediate terms, the mass trespass of 1932 represented a defeat for the Manchester Ramblers, but it turned out to be a catalyst for change. Publicity about the affair led to the formation in 1935 of the Ramblers Association. The 1949 National Parks and Countryside Act gained access to the moors of Kinder Scout and the Peak District. Bernard Rothman was born on June 1, 1911, to Jewish Romanian parents who had come to Britain via America at the turn of the century. He won a scholarship to the Central High School for Boys in Manchester, but had to leave at the age of 14 to earn his living. He became an errand boy at a city garage and soon earned enough to buy a bicycle, on which he set off in 1925 for his first solo expedition to the countryside in Snowdonia. At the garage, he befriended a Scottish mechanic, who invited his young workmate to Sunday night debates in the Clarion Cafe on Market Street, Manchester, a favourite haunt of Trotskyists, ILP members, socialists, communists, and other assorted leftists. Rothman joined the Young Communist League and became involved in advertising the party's new publication, The Daily Worker, chalking slogans on walls and pavements round the city. On one occasion, he unwisely wrote a slogan on the pavement outside a police station and was promptly arrested and charged with causing an obstruction. I was fined 7 and 6pence, a week's wages, he recalled. That was my first taste of justice. In the 1920s, the YCL and its subsidiary, the British Workers' Sports Federation, began organising weekend camps in the Derbyshire countryside, morally and physically bracing affairs of spuds, blankets and canvas, and Rothman became an enthusiastic participant. We'd have 50 or 60 people a weekend, he recalled, all ages from 15 to over 50. Our weekend activities were mainly rambling with sing-songs around the campfire at night. One of Rothman's jobs was segregating the sexes, or keeping the buggers apart, as he put it. In 1932, Rothman and a group staying at a camp held at Raworth went for a ramble on Bleaklow, where they were driven off by keepers. It was not at all unusual for ramblers to get very, very badly beaten by them, Rothman claimed, and of course if you were working class there was no redress. Back at the camp, Rothman and his friends set to work to plan the mass trespass at Kinder Scout. By the time he was released from jail, Rothman had lost his job, so he decided to become a full-time political activist. Moving to Burnley, he worked for the YCL in helping to organise the unsuccessful Moorloom strike in the Lancashire textile industry. Later he returned to Manchester, where he found work as a garage mechanic. As the decade wore on, Rothman became involved in attempts to disrupt meetings of Sir Oswald Mosley's Black Shirts. On one occasion, after throwing anti-fascist leaflets from a meeting hall balcony, he was set upon by half a dozen Black Shirts, who threw him over the balcony into the crowd. That night, Mosley travelled down to London in a first-class carriage with the Chief Constable of Manchester, Rothman recalled. In the mid-1930s, he found work at A.V. Rose Aircraft Factory, but his communism brought him into conflict with management, so he moved on to Metropolitan Vickers in Trafford Park, where there was a more unionised workforce. He volunteered for the army at the outbreak of war in 1939, but was rejected as being in a reserved occupation. After the war, he became active in the trade union movement. Little more was heard of Rothman until the 1980s, when he resurfaced at the head of protests against conservative countryside legislation. Among other achievements, he was credited with winning concessions for ramblers during the passage of the bill to privatise the water industry. Rothman lived in a neat, semi-detached house in the Manchester suburb of Timberley, took a daily walk in his allotment, and enjoyed weekend drives to the moors in his larder with his wife Lily. In 1992, he led a commemorative ramble up Kinder Scout to mark the 60th anniversary of the first mass trespass. Benny Rothman's wife Lily died last year. He is survived by their son and daughter. Daily Telegraph obituaries, January the 25th, 2002. In the 2 years prior to his death, Benny had the satisfaction of knowing that the primary objective that he and his working-class comrades had fought for, the right of ordinary people to roam freely on uncultivated land in their own country, had at last been largely won thanks to the Crow Act, providing access to all uncultivated upland land in England and Wales, enacted by another Labour government in the year 2000. Amongst other things, the Act provides a new right of public access on foot to areas of open land comprising mountain, moor, heath, down and registered common land, and contains provision for extending the right to coastal land. The Act also provides safeguards which take into account the needs of landowners and occupiers and of other interests, including, and perhaps most importantly, in my view, wildlife. I must at this point declare an interest, for the next drinker in the railway on Lapwing Lane in West Didsbury who declares I am a member of the latter category won't be the first. Perhaps the events most likely to have put a wry smile on Benny Rothman's face, if only he'd lived to witness it, occurred at the 70th anniversary, when the present Duke of Devonshire, the 11th of that line, apologised for the actions of his grandfather, calling it a great wrong and a shaming event in my family. However, the Devonshires still owe vast estates. Although Kinder Scout has been bought by the National Trust, Chatsworth is not their only stately home. They own Bolton Abbey and Lismore Castle and its estates in Ireland. Furthermore, the poor of Hayfield have little chance of an early return of the 40 acres once known as Poor Man's Peace and Poor Man's Wood. In other parts of the world, acts of land theft continue on a daily and sustained basis, whether it be in the rainforests of Amazonia, the mineral-rich outback of Australia, the rural areas of China and India, the savannas and forests of Africa, the cold regions of Alaska, northern Canada and Siberia, or the ice-shrouded Arctic wastes. Thus, people continue to be thrown off the land, their traditional ways of life destroyed, wildlife persecuted, and the needs of majorities are constantly subordinated to the greed and immorality of wealthy minorities in pursuance of ever more profit. So the age-old struggle continues. But our rulers should beware. Working people and toilers everywhere are a bit like grains of gunpowder. A single grain is of no consequence, but amass the grains together, first into grams and then into kilograms and then into tons, and the fireworks are likely to begin. On a final cautionary note to the rich and powerful, the first Earl of Devonshire, Sir John Cavendish, 1345 to 1381, became Chief Justice of the King's Bench. In this capacity, he helped suppress the Peasants' Revolt. One of its leaders, Wat Tyler, was summoned to parley with the authorities, and during the course of the negotiations, the Mayor of London, William Walworth, struck at Tyler with a sword, delivering a severe wound to his neck. The cowardly second son of the judicial Earl of Devonshire, another John Cavendish, not content with this, took his own sword to Tyler, killing him on the spot. However, Sir John Cavendish the father paid the price for his son's disgraceful act. Peasants pursued him relentlessly, determined to avenge their leader. They finally caught him, and he was taken to the marketplace at Bury St. Edmunds, tried, found guilty of land theft and murder, and subsequently beheaded by an orderly and sober crowd, led by one Jack Straw, on the 15th of June, 1381. His remains are buried in the town where he was executed. This audiobook, narrated by its author, has been brought to you by the Northern Grove Publishing Project in support of the Working Class Movement Library, 51 The Crescent, Salford, M5 4.